Carl Sifakis, in his work The Mafia Encyclopedia, started his section on Carlo Gambino like this. After Lucky Luciano left the American crime scene, only one mob leader exhibited the cunning and the brains to become what may be described as the de facto boss of bosses in the American Mafia. Gambino was born in late August or early September in Palermo, Sicily. He wasn't a large man, but small in size, standing only 5 feet 8 inches tall. In his later years, he took on the look of a kindly old grandfather. He had a prominent nose and displayed a perpetually friendly smile used to disarm everyone he came in contact with, especially his enemies. But as the old adage goes, never judge a book by its cover. In Sicily, he seemed to idolize the men of honor and their lifestyle. I don't want to spend too much time on his brief years in Sicily, but fair to say he was kind of born into the Sicilian Mafia. He immigrated to the United States in 1921 when he was 19 years old. He was a stowaway on a ship and settled in Brooklyn with his cousins, who were already involved with the Mafia in this country, the Castellanos. He became a gang member under Joe the Boss Mazzaria. At first, he sided with Joe the Boss in the Castellamarese War. But when Luciano and Lansky turned on their leader for carrying on what they considered was a frivolous war cutting into their bootlegging profits, he switched sides going along with their plans. And Luciano and Lansky's plans? The Mustache Pete's had to go. After Mazzaria was whacked, Gambino was left with no choice but to work with the only guy left, Salvatore Maranzano. When Maranzano set up the 5 families, he went to work for Vincent Mongado. Maranzano himself was whacked 6 months later. Carlo was said to be a great family man, but even that couldn't curb his enthusiasm for money and power. In 1926, he married his cousin, Catherine Castellano, and they were to have 3 sons and a daughter. Their sons' names were Thomas, Joseph, and Carlo, and his daughter was Phyllis. In 1951, Albert Anastasia had Vincent Mongado and his brother Philip knocked off. So he went to work for Anastasia, who became the head of the Mongado family, now known as the Gambinos. But then someone wanted Anastasia out of the picture. Some say it could have been Gambino, others named Trafficani and Lansky. When Anastasia was murdered in 1957, Gambino took control of the Borgata and inherited numerous operations including gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, narcotics, trafficking, and notably labor racketeering, with extensive control over the waterfronts. But Gambino didn't like narcotics trafficking. He, like his fictional character Vito Corleone in the movie The Godfather, believing that a narcotics conviction would invite scrutiny and possible infiltration into the family by the feds. Some reports state that when Gambino took over from Anastasia, there was still a lot of bad blood between the family and Lansky and Trafficani, because Anastasia had attempted to strong-arm his way into Cuban gambling. But Gambino decided to make peace with them. He expanded his nationwide gambling and stayed out of Cuba. The Mob Museum explains, he forged strong ties with mob bosses in New England, New Jersey, New Orleans, Florida, Chicago, California, Pennsylvania, and Detroit, among other locales, broadening his reach well beyond his Empire State stomping grounds. Gambino was liked by most crime bosses. And we should make note of the waterfront. J. Robert Nash writes, his control of the waterfront unions was nearly absolute. And this is why I believe it was Lansky and Trafficani who had Anastasia knocked off. Gambino allowed Anastasia's brother, Tony, to stay as the point man for the union and over the docks. never going after him. This is something that is rarely done, if ever, in the American Mafia. And Tony, as far as I could tell, never blamed Gambino for whacking his brother. Please see our video on this channel on Tough Tony Anastasio. Gambino, like the fictional Vito Corleone, wasn't showy. He lived in a modest house, drove in an average car, wore ordinary clothes, and loved to buy fruit from street vendors. For this reason and others, he managed to survive for nearly 20 years at the top of his organization by keeping a low profile. Biography.com echoes this conclusion when they write, Gambino, unlike many other mobsters, always kept a low profile, making sure to stay out of the spotlight and live unostentatiously in a modest row house in Brooklyn. His frail, grandfatherly appearance made it difficult to believe that at the time he was the single most powerful organized crime figure in America and one of the most ruthless. Although both Fed and state authorities had been after him for years, his secretive and elusive nature thwarted their efforts. The Mob Museum writes, in the 1930s, Gambino was convicted of running a illegal liquor still and almost served 2 years in federal prison, but that was the last time he would ever serve time behind bars. Other writers seem to indicate differently. He was arrested numerous times for tax evasion, larceny, and probation violations, but never seemed to serve jail time. Except one article has him serving 22 months in 1937 for tax evasion. You can probably see why things get confusing and why I don't hold firm on anything that I read. In 1970, he was indicted for hijacking, but he never served any jail time. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1970 upheld an order for his deportation because he had illegally entered the country. But severe heart attacks postponed his deportation. In fact, it never happened. Again signing the Mob Museum. In 1972, Gambino's 30-year-old nephew, Manny, was kidnapped and murdered by an Irish mob crew led by James Jimmy from Queens McBratney. The Irish hoodlums had been kidnapping Italian mafiosi and had extorted six-figure cash ransoms for their release for more than a year when they had grabbed the younger Gambino. Gambino called on John Gotti, then an up-and-comer in the ranks of his crime family, and the protege of his underboss Neil Della Croce. Angelo Fat Ange Ruggiero, and another wise guy named Ralphie Wiggs Gallioni gunned down McBratney in a Staten Island tavern in May 1973. They all were eventually convicted and imprisoned for the crime. It seems in business, Gambino didn't make many mistakes. But the glaring one, the one that most insiders and outsiders would agree upon, and it was actually his biggest error in judgment, was the appointment of his cousin, Big Paul Castellano, to head the family after he died. Months and years later, because of Castellano's actions, factionalism was in the air, and Castellano himself was rubbed out in 1985. But not Don Carlo. Even though the reign of a boss seems to be between 6 to 8 years on average before they are either dead or in prison, Gambino died of a heart attack comfortably in his bed at his Long Island home on October 15, 1976. He was 74 years old. One final note by the Mob Museum in Vegas. More than 40 years after Gambino's death, the New York crime family is still named for him, although decimated by the federal crackdowns during the Gotti era. The Gambino family is still involved in various criminal activities in Brooklyn and Staten Island.